Initial Thoughts is a spoiler-free movie review series. All opinions are my own.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Initial Thoughts, a series in which we talk about films as and when they are released. Today's film we're talking about is one of the biggest releases of the summer of 2025, Superman, the new start to a new DC universe, which is directed, of course, by James Gunn and stars David Corenswet, Nicholas Hoult and Rachel Brosnahan. So after a lot of hype, a lot of build-up, and a lot of feeling of we need to reset, we need to scrap everything that came before, and let's just start fresh, bring a new head of development in with James Gunn, the DC Universe is finally here. It's been talked about, it was ended quite abruptly, but rightly in my opinion. The last thing we had was things like the second Aquaman film, The Flash. There wasn't, it was very much teetering out anyway, and I think a reset was a good idea. But saying that didn't mean I went into this. A lot of people seem to have went into this film and Superman and James Gunn being attached, and there is right, or maybe it's better to say people are understandably excited going in because you got James Gunn, because his track record is pretty damn good so far. I mean, the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy, but especially that first film, really, really brilliant. Then you've got the Suicide Squad, the actual good Suicide Squad and not the rubbish one. Again, he's been in the DC before. Then he's got the Peacemaker stuff with John Cena. Pretty good track record. And James Gunn is, for all intents and purposes, a director that gets you caring about characters, I would say. Especially quirky characters, especially characters you wouldn't think you would care for. A talking tree, a raccoon. I mean, they're probably the two best examples. But all that being said, I have to say, I am not a massive Superman fan. I would say I'm a massive Batman fan. Not because I read the comic. I'm not a comic book guy. I'm not someone who, is really read up on all the characters and have lived vicariously through them on the comic book side of things. But I have to say, DC has really shone with certain films. The Nolan trilogy, of course, particularly The Dark Knight. I mean, me saying that is like saying water's wet. I mean, it's the most obvious thing. Even more recently, Matt Reeves' The Batman, one of the first 10 out of 10 I gave on this channel. A really, really brilliant film. So DC is not, Marvel and DC being such a yin and yang of each other. They're ultimately trying to get the same goal here. Marvel was the first to really capture the brilliance of a universe with movies being connected, characters being connected, recurring characters, etc., etc. But then it's kind of lost its way, certainly in its last wee while. It's had a bit of a resurgence this year, but not enough so far. So there is an opportunity here for DC to really start strong and build on it. But the reason I mentioned there about I having a real love for the character of Batman and the characters through that, as a contrast, Superman has never ever been a character I never really got the hype, if that makes sense. For me, the best iterations I've ever seen of the Superman character, this alien being coming to Earth and being, supposed to be its protector, the most interesting versions of that character on the big screen, I should say, would be in Zack Snyder's Justice League, the kind of black suit Superman, which is a bit more grey, if you like, in the way of where he lies on good and evil. That was probably the most I enjoyed him on the big screen. But particularly, and this is the one I always harpen back to, Homelander in The Boys is the best iteration, with a honourable mention to Omni-Man in Invincible. This kind of off-world being that comes, the villain version is always so much better because you've got the character work you can do as a contrast to that works so well. And when you see movies, I mean, it hasn't been helped by movies like Man of Steel, Batman versus Superman. the first Justice League, the Justice League, it really hasn't been helped by all that. And for me, that's maybe why the character has sunk in my hype for a character. So when I hear that this new DC universe is being led by, or started by, Superman film, I wouldn't say I was enthusiastic, let's say. But again, James Gunn attached, sounded like an interesting cast. I'm not too familiar with David Cornsweet before this, but certainly familiar with Nicholas Hoult. I talked about him recently in Nosferatu, about how he's quite possibly one of the most underrated actors working today, in the amount of brilliant projects he aligns himself with and is a core part of. And Rachel Brosnahan, I remember her in things like House of Cards years ago, but I haven't really seen her in too many things. So it was more intrigue than expectation coming into this. But I will say, I did hope that this will be a good building block for what will come next. What will inevitably come in the next 5, 10, 15, however many years this universe lasts. I hope this is a good enough building block with characters and intriguing story points to take, and we can look fondly back on this film. So, with all that being said, what did I think of Superman 2025? If you've been online, you'll have seen the discourse already, and it seems to be one of the more controversial films this year, just in the case of opinion. Because I've seen some critics online, I've seen some fans online hating the film, saying it's a disaster, saying it's the best film and it's as perfect as it can be. There seems to be it's quite a varied opinion online for this film. It isn't an overwhelming negative, and it certainly isn't an overwhelming positive either. And to be honest with you, I think that's about fair, because I can totally see the positive side of this. I liked a lot of this movie, but I have to say there is negatives here too. There definitely is, and the negatives are probably the more prominent one to talk about. So let's start by talking about the negatives here. The negatives of this film is basically the entirety of the story, and it's a very weak narrative, kind of from the start and throughout. And you know, even some of the story beats border on silly. And I know you're kind of riding that line, and it will obviously get compared to things like Guardians of the Galaxy because of James Gunn being in the director's seat, but I have to say, something that maybe goes underrated, and maybe there's a little bit of expectation with this, with James Gunn films now. And I actually apply this more in my own memory to the Suicide Squad film. You know, his own Suicide Squad film with John Cena and Idris Elba and whoever else was in that film. Something that was the best part about that was the comedy. And of course, this is the most subjective thing. I mean, comedy and horror, we talk about this all the time. And comedy being subjective. But I don't think, bar maybe one or two times in the entirety of this over 2 hours runtime for Superman, I cracked a smile or laughed. It's not that funny of a film. Not that the jokes don't land, it's just that it isn't as quirky as I thought it would be. But the way it's structured makes you think it would be more. It tries to be serious to somewhat of an effect, and then it tries to be. It almost like the baseline is a comedy film, but there's no comedy or jokes that are really effective throughout this. And again, that's maybe more of an expectation on me, and maybe that's more of a me problem than it is the movie problem, admittedly. Because for Superman, my experience on the big screen isn't that good. And especially in something like Zack Snyder's Justice League, as I said, that was probably my favourite iteration of the character on the big screen. Admittedly, not a great selection to choose from. You've got Superman Returns, Man of Steel, etc. Not very good. But with all that being said, that was something that was more of the James Gunn expectation rather than the character and the universe we're in. I have to say, I didn't find it that funny of a film. I found it charming, is probably a better word. Especially, and talking, kind of jumping ahead to a positive here, but something that James Gunn does so well, and I will, from kind of critiquing him there about his lack of comedy here, or lack of effective comedy, to a positive that he does, and this kind of shines through in all of his films, from, as I say, talking raccoons, talking trees, giant sharks, all of that. In here, the real star of the show is Crypto the dog. And again, you care so much for a dog in very little screen time at the start, and then as it becomes more and more prominent throughout the film, I mean, it's an easy win. Easy win. Everybody loves dogs. So, that was an easy win, and that is something that is a real shining light of this film, and Crypto's involvement is a kind of James Gunnism, if that makes sense, that really does work. But the other thing, kind of negatively, I do want to talk about is the pacing. Because, I'll be honest, for the first half, maybe approaching the end of the second act even, I wasn't loving this movie, I have to say. I didn't dislike it, but the second half, or certainly the last 30 minutes to 45 minutes, is the best of this movie. The closing act is by far and away the best part. There's a section in the middle of the film, you've seen it in the trailer, when he's chatting to his dad. Kind of from then onwards is when this film really gets going and kind of hooks you back in after it loses you a bit with the first half. But once it gets into that second act, it's good. And as I say, I don't want to really hamper it too much by talking about the negatives, because they're just things that were very evident to me. The lack of comedy, the pacing, the story itself being a pretty weak one when you look at it from, if you were looking at it on paper, what this story's about, it's not very deep in any way. But something that actually did surprise me, and I did mention this a little bit at the start there when I talked about, and I know I keep harping back to it, but it's such a James Gunn-ism to use that phrase again. His work with characters. Now, there are a few characters in here that are kind of thrown in as additional characters. Yes, they're part of the plot, of course, but they, I imagine, will be fleshed out a little bit more in either following movies or TV shows or whatever it will be. They will be involved, and I look forward to seeing what comes next for them. Them being particularly Green Lantern, Nathan Fillion's Green Lantern, and Isabella Marced's Hawk Girl. I think it's Hawk Girl? Yeah. So, those two characters in particular, they don't really get to shine too much in this movie, but I look forward to seeing what happens with them next. The other of their group that actually does get to shine quite a lot, especially in that closing act, is Mr. Terrific, a comic book character I have never heard of before. I admit I'm not, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not someone who's too well versed in the comic books or know the depth, particularly of the DC side of things, but a good character, and actually worked well into the story when it gets into its better part in the latter half. But the three I want to talk about are the three I mentioned off the start of the video, the three main leads here. And I'll talk about the one that kind of is maybe the one that might go a little bit under the radar in comparison to the other two, and that's our Lois Lane. Rachel Brosnahan, I have to say, she already supersedes Amy Adams as Lois Lane. It doesn't take much. I think Amy Adams is a good actress, but I never, ever liked her in that role from the start. I think Rachel Brosnahan really works into the role well. She has enough charm, but more than anything else, she is very self-sufficient. She is not a damsel in distress in any way in this film. And I think that's very evident from basically her introduction, and it gets stronger throughout the film. That worked well. The other one I mentioned there, before we talk about the main man, is Nicholas Hoult. Nicholas Hoult as Lex Luthor. I mean, I'm a big fan of Nicholas Hoult. I mentioned earlier about talking about him recently in Nosferatu and how much he really is going from strength to strength in his career. I thought he was pretty good as Lex Luthor. I wouldn't say he was amazing. I wouldn't say he was steal the show, fantastic, one of the best villains of all time, because he wasn't. But he was definitely a hell of a lot better than Jesse Eisenberg as Lex Luthor, because of course he was. I liked him in the role. I think as this universe gets fleshed out more and more, and inevitably we see him again, whenever that may be, I think a second outing will likely be a lot stronger and a lot more emotionally driven than this first one. The first one, or this encounter between Lex Luthor and Superman, is more of a, okay, here's what you kind of know, even from your own knowledge, just Lex Luthor and Superman. That's what you, as fans, or maybe not even fans, I think even, as Superman still being a household name, would know his villain is Lex Luthor, as he's certainly the most famous villain. And that kind of plays into that throughout this movie. But I think the depth will come, as I say, for what will come next. But talking about character work, and I think this is the biggest point, and I think this is probably the best thing that this movie does. David Cornsweet as Superman. I thought he was really, really good in the role. Really charming, really charismatic, and is definitely... I like Henry Cavill a lot. I'm a big fan of Henry Cavill's, but I think he's shone in so many other things far more than he did as Superman in Man of Steel or any of those other films. I never thought he was a great Superman, and as I say, I've never really been a big fan of the character. I'm a fan of David Cornsweet's Superman coming out of this film. I liked his character a lot. I thought the character work with him, the way he bounces off other people, his role in society as Superman, his role with his parents, everything worked well. And I suppose, at the end of the day, if you're going into a Superman film, and it's led by that man, if that character doesn't work, the movie doesn't work whatsoever. The high point of Superman for me is the character work, completely the character work, but especially David Cornsweet as the lead man. I thought he was definitely the best part of this. But overall, I'm a bit conflicted as it comes to scoring time here, because I liked the film. And as I say, there's positives and negatives there. I see, the online discourse, people really not liking this, people really loving this. I kind of get both sides. I can understand why you wouldn't like this film for the negatives I mentioned. And I can understand why you love the film for the positives I mentioned, and particularly the character work. So, it is a bit conflicted. For me personally, the first half does too much damage to really... It hampers this too much to stop it from being a really great film. I still think it's an enjoyable time. And as I kind of alluded to there a few times, I think this is... It's more of a movie of moments. There's good scenes and memorable scenes throughout it. But as a movie from start to finish, it's pretty poor in that regard, especially in the pacing and for that first half. So I am very conflicted, if you couldn't tell already. So as we get to rating time here, I was debating between a 6 and a 7. And I can't really... It doesn't really tilt too far either of the ways. So for me, Superman is a 6.5 out of 10. I liked some stuff. I loved some stuff. I loved the character work. I loved Crypto. I loved that stuff. I really didn't like the story. I really didn't like the pacing. And I think to build a universe from, if it had been the other way around, the pacing and the pacing and the story were great, but the characters you never wanted to see again, I think that would have been a real hard thing to continue from. So it's actually in a decent enough place to build from. Yes, this isn't a high point, and I would imagine, and I would certainly hope, that the following films and TV shows and everything that will come for Superman in the future, or from Superman, for the DC universe building from Superman, I would hope that they will take what is good in here and add in a lot more work on the story. I don't know if they rushed the story. I know it did take a while, from the announcement of James Gunn taking over to this movie being released. But I don't know if they, as I say, rushed the script out to get this, on the road really quickly. But regardless, Superman, a bit of a conflicted review here. I liked it, didn't love it. Do I think it's a good building block? I think it can be. I think if they take, as I say, the good, the positives here and build from those and, apply the same character work to what they're going to bring in the following movies and TV shows, I think it will do well. I think we could be on for a decent cinematic universe. I wouldn't say we're on for something really special here, just on this first basis. But as a building block, it could have been a hell of a lot worse, let's be honest. And yeah, that has been my review for Superman 2025. The start of another universe. It's crazy, isn't it, how many of these universes exist now? From horror to comedy, for certainly the superhero side of things. So many universes nowadays. It's hard to think back to when there wasn't really that. There was obviously long series of films that had lots of sequels, but, now there's just, infinite amount of movies that can come in these. But, let's see. Let's hope that what comes next will be pretty good and certainly better than this. If they start to go worse than this, I would worry pretty quickly. But this movie's pretty decent. I think the biggest thing, before I go here, I think the biggest thing online is, I think the people that really hate the film are possibly the ones that expected this to be the best superhero film they've ever seen. For me, I never came into it with any expectation, as you heard, so maybe that's why I fall in the camp with which there seems to be like a pretty even divide. Some people truly loved this; they got everything they wanted out of this, and I'm so happy that that's the case. People that hated it, fair enough. If it's not what you wanted, I can understand for certain parts, but for me, it's decent. It's not any more than that, but it's not any less than that either. So anyway, yeah, that has been my review. I want to take this opportunity to thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to me talking about yet another movie. If you want to stick around on this channel or any of my other socials, I would appreciate you so much for it. If you want to hit subscribe, nearly at 4K here on YouTube, which is unbelievable. If you want to follow me on TikTok, nearly at 2K on there. If you want to follow me on Letterboxd, we're at, 27,000 on there currently, which is wild. All the socials, I'm there, even on Twitter and Blue Sky, just for any updates on videos being released. If you want to follow me on any of those, or if you're just here for this video, I appreciate you taking time out of your day to listen to me talk about a movie. And if you do stick around, I will hopefully see you in the next one. Bye, guys.
Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Before you go, here are some of my other videos. For updates and information on upcoming videos, the best place to find us is my Twitter. Much love, everyone.